The howling wind shook the windows of Grayson Zimmer's small cabin, rattling them like the bones of a hanged man at the gallows. The blizzard had descended without warning, transforming the Nebraska Territory prairie around Council Bluffs into a white wasteland. Grayson stoked the fire, watching as his breath formed clouds in the air despite being indoors. February of 1858 had brought the worst winter anyone in these parts could remember, but something in his gut told him to venture out to check his trap lines before nightfall. "Hell of a day to be alive," he muttered, shrugging into his sheepskin coat. At 32, Grayson had survived the California gold fields, Apache raids, and a bullet to the shoulder courtesy of a Kansas border ruffian. A little snow shouldn't bother him, yet as he adjusted his hat and wrapped a scarf around his neck, he felt an unusual foreboding. His horse, Samson, greeted him with an irritable whinny from the small attached stable. "I know, old boy," Grayson said, patting the dun gelding's neck. "But we won't be out long. Just need to check those traps before the snow covers them completely." Mounting up, he guided Samson into the swirling white, the snow already knee-high and deepening. The wind cut through his layers like a knife, but Grayson had endured worse. He'd been working this land for 3 years now, after deciding the life of a drifting cowhand wasn't for him anymore. Though Cowboy still followed him like a shadow once you'd spent a decade driving cattle, the title stuck to you like trail dust. The trapline followed Mosquito Creek, which now lay frozen and buried beneath the snow. As Grayson checked his third empty trap, a flicker of color caught his eye downstream, something that didn't belong in the endless white. Squinting through the snow, he saw what looked like a bundle of fabric. Curious, he urged Samson closer, the horse protesting with each step through the deepening drifts. As he drew near, Grayson's heart lurched. Not a bundle, a person. "Whoa, boy," he said, pulling Samson to a halt and dismounting. He trudged through the snow, sinking to his thighs with each step. It was a woman, collapsed face down in the snow. Her dress, once fine but now torn and soaked through, offered little protection against the elements. A traveling case lay nearby, half buried. She wasn't moving. "Madam," Grayson called, kneeling beside her. When she didn't respond, he carefully turned her over, brushing snow from her face. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, with delicate features nearly blue with cold. Her dark hair was frozen in strands around her face. To Grayson's relief, a faint cloud of breath escaped her lips. "Still alive," he breathed. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her still form. "I'm getting you somewhere warm, madam. You'll be all right." The woman's eyelids fluttered. Her lips, cracked and pale, moved slightly. "Don't try to talk," Grayson said, lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird with hollow bones. "I've got you now." Her eyes opened briefly, a startling violet blue, before closing again. Grayson carried her to Samson, who shifted nervously. "Easy," he murmured, managing to drape the woman across the saddle before mounting behind her. He cradled her against his chest with one arm while gripping the reins with his free hand. "Let's get home, quick as you can." The ride back seemed endless, the snow falling harder now, reducing visibility to mere yards. Grayson hunched over the woman, trying to shield her from the worst of the wind. Without his coat, the cold bit into him, but he barely noticed, focused solely on keeping her alive. By the time the cabin came into view, his fingers were numb and his face felt like a frozen mask. Samson, sensing home, picked up his pace. Inside, Grayson laid the woman on his bed and quickly built up the fire until it roared. He removed her wet clothes with clinical efficiency, averting his eyes as much as possible while he wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Her skin was cold as the grave, her breathing shallow. "Come on now," he urged, rubbing her hands between his. Stay with me." For hours, Grayson worked to warm her, boiling water for hot compresses, keeping the fire blazing and periodically checking her pulse. As night fell, he sat beside the bed, exhaustion pulling at him. "I'll be damned if I let you die on me, miss," he whispered. "I promise you that." It was near midnight when she finally stirred. A soft moan escaped her lips as her eyes flickered open, confused and frightened. Where am I?" she rasped, her voice barely audible. "You're safe," Grayson said, moving closer. "Found you collapsed in the snow. I'm Grayson Zimmer. You're in my cabin near Council Bluffs." She tried to sit up but fell back weakly. "Violet," she managed. "Violet Sinclair, Miss Sinclair," he nodded. "What in heaven's name were you doing out in that blizzard?" Her eyes filled with tears. "The stagecoach overturned the driver, the others." She shuddered. "I tried to find help." "Rest now," Grayson said gently. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." Violet's hand caught his, her grip surprisingly firm despite her weakness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving my life. Anyone would have done the same." Her eyes, piercing even in her weakened state, held his. "No, not anyone." Then she slipped back into unconsciousness, her breathing steadier now. Grayson settled into his chair by the fire, watching over her through the night. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, but within the cabin, a fragile flame of life had been preserved. Dawn broke with blinding brightness, the storm having moved on during the night. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes and the sleeping form of Violet Sinclair. Grayson, who had dozed in his chair, awoke with a start when she spoke. "Water, please." He hurried to fetch a cup, helping her sit up to drink. Color had returned to her cheeks, though she still looked frail. "Better today?" he asked. She nodded, taking in her surroundings. Realization dawned in her eyes as she clutched the blankets tighter. "My clothes. Had to get you out of those wet things," Grayson explained, turning slightly to give her privacy. "They're drying by the fire. I've got a spare shirt you can wear for now." Violet accepted the offered garment with a murmured thanks. "Could you?" "Of course." Grayson stepped outside to tend to Samson, giving her time to dress. The air was sharp and clear, the world transformed into a glittering white expanse. He'd need to dig paths to the woodpile and outhouse soon, but first he'd check on his guest. When he returned, Violet was sitting up in bed, swimming in his flannel shirt. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and in daylight he could see that her eyes weren't just blue, but an unusual shade that shifted between blue and violet. "You mentioned a stagecoach accident," Grayson said, setting about making coffee. "Were you traveling to Council Bluffs?" "Through it," she replied, her voice stronger now. "I was bound for Omaha. My aunt lives there." "That's a fair distance still. What brought you out this way?" Violet's hands twisted in the blanket. "I was living in St. Louis. My father died last month and I had to leave." Something in her tone suggested more to the story, but Grayson didn't press. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Sinclair. Please call me Violet," she said. "After what you've done for me, formalities seem unnecessary." Grayson nodded, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Violet, then. You should know this storm's left at least 3 feet of snow. We're not going anywhere for a while." Her face fell. "My aunt will be worried sick, and the others from the coach. Someone should look for them." "As soon as it's possible to travel, I'll check the stagecoach line," Grayson promised. "But you said the accident happened yesterday, in this cold." Violet closed her eyes, understanding his unspoken meaning. "They're dead, all of them." "Most likely," he said gently. "I'm sorry." They fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. Grayson had lived alone so long that having another person in his space felt strange, but not unpleasant. "Are you a trapper, Mr. Zimmer?" Violet asked eventually, gesturing to the pelts hanging from the walls. Grayson, he corrected, and only in winter. Come spring I raise horses, small operation but growing. He hesitated. I was a cowboy for years before that, drove cattle from Texas up to Kansas. That sounds like quite a life, she said, genuine interest in her voice. Very different from St. Louis. I reckon it is, Grayson agreed, serving up a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses. City living never appealed to me much. It has its merits, Violet said, accepting the bowl gratefully, but also its dangers. Again, Grayson sensed a story behind her words but didn't pry. They ate in companionable silence, the strangeness of their situation, a proper city woman and a frontier cowboy sharing a one-room cabin, gradually fading. Over the next 3 days, the snow began to melt, though travel remained impossible. Grayson dug paths around his property, chopped more firewood, and tended to Samson and his 2 mares in the stable. Violet regained her strength rapidly, insisting on helping with cooking and mending some of Grayson's clothes. On the 4th evening, as they sat by the fire, Violet finally shared her story. My father was a respected physician in St. Louis, she began, her fingers working a needle through one of Grayson's shirts. After my mother died 10 years ago, it was just the 2 of us. He was everything to me. Grayson watched her from his chair, noticing how the firelight caught in her hair. When he passed pneumonia, ironically enough, I discovered he'd left significant debts. Our house was mortgaged to the hilt. Within weeks, everything was gone. She bit her lip. But that wasn't the worst of it. What happened? Grayson asked quietly. Father's business partner, Dr. Hargrove, offered to take care of me. He's 63 with a reputation for inappropriate behavior with young women. Violet's needle stabbed through the fabric with unnecessary force. When I refused his proposal, he threatened to spread rumors that would ruin what remained of my good name. Said no respectable household would hire me as a governess or companion. Grayson's jaw tightened. Bastard. Indeed, Violet agreed. My aunt in Omaha was my only hope. She's unconventional, never married, runs her own millinery shop. She wrote offering me a place to stay and work. So you fled. With little more than the clothes on my back and my mother's jewelry sewn into my petticoats, she confirmed. Dr. Hargrove discovered my plans and tried to stop me at the station. I barely escaped onto the westbound train. Grayson whistled low. You're braver than most men I've known, Violet Sinclair. She smiled faintly. Necessity rather than courage, I assure you. Disagree, he said simply. Plenty of women would have taken the easy path with that doctor. A gilded cage is still a cage, she replied. I'd rather face the wilderness than sacrifice my freedom. Their eyes met across the room, an understanding passing between them. 2 people who valued independence above all else, yet found themselves inexorably drawn to one another. The following morning, Grayson saddled Samson. I'm going to check the stage-coach route, he told Violet, who stood wrapped in his spare coat at the cabin door. See if I can find the accident site. Be careful, she said, concern evident in her voice. The snow's still deep in places. He tipped his hat. I always am. Grayson followed the stage road for several miles until he found the overturned coach, half buried in a snowdrift. The sight was grim. 4 bodies, including the driver and 3 male passengers, frozen solid. There was no sign of luggage beyond what had been scattered nearby, suggesting thieves had already visited the scene. He removed his hat in respect, then spent an hour digging a communal grave, the best he could manage with the ground still partially frozen. After saying a brief prayer over the site, he gathered what remained of Violet's traveling case and turned Samson homeward. When he returned and shared the news, Violet wept quietly for the strangers who had died while she survived. I never even learned their names, she said, wiping her eyes. We were all strangers, just sharing a journey. That's often the way of it out here, Grayson said, placing her recovered case beside her. Found this. Not much left inside, I'm afraid. Violet opened it to find a few sodden books and a damaged photograph of a distinguished-looking man, her father, she explained. Everything else had been ruined by snow or taken by scavengers. At least I still have this, she said, touching the photograph gently, and what I carried with me. She patted her side, where Grayson presumed the mentioned jewelry remained hidden. That evening, as they shared a rabbit stew, Grayson broke the comfortable silence. Weather's clearing. Probably be able to make it to Council Bluffs in another day or two. Telegraph office there can send word to your aunt. Violet nodded, though something like regret flickered across her face. You've been so kind, Grayson. I don't know how to repay you. Wasn't looking for payment, he replied. Anyone would have done the same. You said that before, she smiled. I still don't believe it. The next day brought warmer temperatures and rapidly melting snow. Grayson tended to his horses while Violet washed her dress, now mended as best she could manage. The domesticity of their arrangement struck him as oddly natural, despite having lived alone for so long. He was brushing down his favorite mare when Violet appeared at the stable door, her dress billowing slightly in the breeze. I've been thinking, she said without preamble. Would it be possible? That is, would you consider? She took a breath. Might I stay and work for you for a while? To earn my passage to Omaha, Grayson turned, surprised. You don't need to do that. I can advance you the stage fare. I know, she said quickly. But I don't want more charity. Besides, I've telegraphed ahead to Aunt Margaret. She's relieved I'm alive but in no rush. Says winter's still harsh in Omaha anyway. He studied her face, trying to read her true motivations. It's not exactly proper, a single woman staying with a man she barely knows. Propriety nearly sold me to a lecherous old doctor, Violet said firmly. Besides, who's to know out here? I can cook, clean, mend, make myself useful until spring proper arrives. Grayson couldn't deny the appeal of her company, nor the help she offered. His bachelor existence had its lonely moments, especially in winter. If that's what you want, he said finally. But you'll be my guest, not my servant. We'll share the work. Relief and something else, happiness, brightened her face. Thank you, Grayson. As February gave way to March, they settled into a routine. Mornings began with breakfast together, followed by shared chores. Grayson taught Violet about caring for the horses, while she introduced improvements to his rustic cooking. In the evenings, she read aloud from his small collection of books, her voice bringing the stories to life in a way he'd never experienced reading alone. One afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing a section of fence, Violet asked about his past. You mentioned being a cowboy, she said, holding a post steady while he hammered. How did you end up here, raising horses in Nebraska territory? Grayson paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. Started driving cattle at 17, Texas to Kansas mostly, hard life but free, did that for nearly a decade. What changed? His expression darkened slightly. Cattle drive in 54. We lost 3 men crossing the Red River in a flash flood. One was just a kid, 14 or so. Watched him get swept away while his horse panicked. He drove the hammer with unnecessary force. Started thinking maybe there were better ways to live. Violet's hand touched his arm gently. I'm sorry. Grayson nodded, continuing his work. Drifted for a while. Worked some ranches. Tried gold mining in California but didn't have the patience for it. Eventually made my way back east. Bought this land cheap from a family heading to Oregon. Started with just Samson and 1 mare. And now you have a proper homestead, she observed, looking around at his modest but well-maintained property. "Getting there," he agreed. "Plan to have the largest horse operation in the territory someday. Good breeding stock, trained proper. Already got buyers interested as far as St. Joseph." Violet smiled. "It's a fine dream, Grayson. Better than chasing someone else's cattle through dust and rain," he said with a shrug. "What about you? Before everything, what did you want from life?" She considered this, handing him nails as needed. "I assisted my father sometimes with his patients. Thought perhaps I might become a nurse. It wasn't common for women, but I had a knack for it." "Still could," Grayson suggested. "Omaha's growing. Might need medical folks." "Perhaps," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Truth is, I never gave much thought to my future. Expected the usual marriage, children. Then when father died..." She trailed off. "Life has a way of changing your plans," Grayson said quietly. Their eyes met, holding for a moment longer than necessary before both looked away. That evening, a spring thunderstorm rolled in, bringing lashing rain that turned the melting snow to slush. They sat before the fire, drinking coffee laced with a splash of whiskey. The close quarters, which had seemed awkward at first, now felt comfortable, companionable. "I should fashion a proper bedroll," Grayson mused, stretching his long legs toward the fire. He'd been sleeping on a pallet of blankets on the floor, insisting Violet keep the bed. "Now that you're staying a while." "I've put you out of your own bed long enough," she protested. "My mother would haunt me if I took the bed while a lady slept on the floor," he said firmly. Violet laughed, the sound bright against the drumming rain. "Tell me about your mother. You rarely mention your family." "Not much to tell," Grayson said, but his expression softened. "She was from Tennessee. Married my father young, followed him west. Had me late in life. I was their only child. She taught school before I was born, kept books in the house even when we barely had food." "Is that where you get your love of reading?" He nodded. "Pa thought it was foolishness. He was a hard man, worked as a farrier, good with horses, not so much with people." Grayson swirled the amber liquid in his cup. "They both died of cholera in '45. I was 19, already working cattle by then." "So you've been alone a long time," Violet observed quietly. "Mostly," he acknowledged. "There were women here and there, nothing lasting." He glanced at her, suddenly self-conscious. "Sorry, not proper conversation." "I think we're past worrying about proper conversation," she said with a wry smile. "Besides, I find I prefer honesty to propriety these days." "What about you?" Grayson asked. "No young man courting the doctor's daughter in St. Louis." Violet's smile turned sad. "There was someone, William Caldwell. We were unofficially engaged. What happened? Father's illness. William's family decided a doctor's daughter with mounting debts wasn't such a good match after all." Her voice was matter of fact, but Grayson could hear the hurt beneath. "He married the banker's daughter instead. Very prudent." "Fool," Grayson muttered. "Practical," Violet corrected. "Though I admit, at the time I was devastated. And now," she considered this, "now I think perhaps it was a blessing. Had we married, I would have been just another society wife, hosting dinner parties and bearing children, never knowing what I was capable of on my own." Thunder crashed overhead, making them both jump, then laugh at their shared reaction. The moment broke the growing tension, returning them to easier conversation as the storm raged outside. As March progressed, the weather continued to improve. Grayson's daily work increased with the approach of spring fences to mend, fields to prepare, and the arrival of his first foal of the season. Violet threw herself into helping, learning quickly and never shying from hard work. Her city pallor gave way to a healthy glow, her hands growing calloused alongside his. They made occasional trips into Council Bluffs for supplies, where Grayson introduced Violet as his cousin from back east, helping him through the spring season. If the shopkeepers had their doubts about this story, they kept them to themselves. The frontier had its own rules about privacy. On one such trip, Violet spent some of her carefully hoarded jewelry money on fabric and sewing supplies. Back at the cabin, she set about making herself 2 new dresses and, to Grayson's surprise, several shirts for him. "Your old ones are nearly threadbare," she explained when he protested. "Consider it part of my board." Grayson accepted the first completed shirt with more emotion than he cared to admit. It had been years since anyone had made something specially for him. One warm afternoon in late March, as they worked in the vegetable garden Violet had insisted on starting, Grayson found himself watching her more than the seeds they were planting. She wore one of her new dresses, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was tied back with a strip of cloth, tendrils escaping around her face as she worked. "What?" she asked, catching him staring. "Nothing," he said quickly, returning his attention to the soil. "Just thinking you look more like a farm woman than a city doctor's daughter these days." Violet sat back on her heels, considering this. "Is that a compliment or an observation?" "Compliment," Grayson said without hesitation. "Suits you somehow." A pleased smile curved her lips. "I find I rather enjoy it, the work, the open air. Even the isolation has its appeal after the constant scrutiny of St. Louis society." Still planning to continue to Omaha, the question hung between them, heavier than it should have been. Violet's hand stilled on the packet of carrot seeds she'd been opening. "I should," she said slowly. "Aunt Margaret is expecting me, and as comfortable as our arrangement is, it can't last forever." "Why not?" The words escaped before Grayson could stop them. Violet looked up sharply. "Pardon," committed now, Grayson set down his trowel. "Why can't it last? You seem happy here, I know I'm." He cleared his throat. "I've grown accustomed to having you around." "Grayson," she said softly, "what exactly are you suggesting?" He stood, suddenly finding it impossible to have this conversation kneeling in the dirt. Violet followed, brushing soil from her skirt. "I'm not good with fancy words," Grayson said, his heart pounding uncomfortably. "But I think you know I've come to care for you, Violet, more than just as a friend or guest." Her eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. I didn't presume." "I'm not asking for anything," he hastened to add. "Just don't feel you have to leave. Not on my account, anyway." For a long moment Violet was silent, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped closer, close enough that Grayson could see flecks of gold in her violet blue eyes. "What if I wanted you to ask for something?" she said quietly. Grayson's breath caught. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand to her cheek. When she leaned into his touch, he felt something tight in his chest loosen. "Violet Sinclair," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I've been falling in love with you since I found you in that snowdrift. If you'd consider staying, not as my guest or helper, but as—" "Yes," she whispered before he could finish. "You don't even know what I was going to ask," he pointed out, a smile tugging at his lips. "Ask it properly, then," she challenged, her own smile radiant. Grayson took a deep breath. "Would you consider becoming my wife, building a life here with me?" In answer, Violet rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then grew in confidence as Grayson's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Violet said, "That's a yes, in case it wasn't clear." Grayson laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Crystal clear, madam." They married 2 weeks later in Council Bluffs, with the local pastor and his wife serving as witnesses. Violet wore her blue dress with a crown of early spring wildflowers in her hair. Grayson, in his new shirt, thought she had never looked more beautiful. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other anew. Grayson, for all his experience, felt like a green boy again, humbled by the trust Violet placed in him. For her part, Violet approached their intimacy with the same curious courage she'd shown in all aspects of frontier life, tentative at first, then increasingly confident as they learned each other's bodies. Afterward, lying with her head on his chest, Violet traced the scar on his shoulder, the bullet wound he'd mentioned from his cattle-driving days. "Happy?" he asked, his fingers playing with her unbound hair. "Remarkably so," she answered truthfully. "Though I keep thinking how unlikely this all is. If that storm hadn't come, if you hadn't found me." "I'd say it was fate," Grayson said, "if I believed in such things." "And do you?" He considered this. "I believe in making your own luck. But I also believe some things are too perfect to be mere chance." Violet propped herself up to look at him. "Like finding a half-frozen woman in a snowdrift and deciding to marry her 6 weeks later." "Exactly like that," he grinned, pulling her down for another kiss. Spring bloomed fully across the prairie, bringing new growth and long, labor-filled days. Grayson's mare delivered 2 more foals, and Violet's garden flourished under her attentive care. They expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the main living area. Violet insisted on bookshelves, which Grayson built with surprising skill, filling them with volumes ordered from as far away as Chicago. In May, Violet's Aunt Margaret finally made the journey from Omaha to meet the cowboy who had saved her niece and won her heart. A formidable woman in her 50s with a sharp wit, she inspected the homestead with a critical eye before pronouncing herself satisfied. "You've done well for yourself, Violet," she told her niece as they walked among the new colts. "This Zimmer fellow may be rough around the edges, but he looks at you like you hung the moon." "I feel the same about him," Violet admitted. "It's not the life I imagined, but I wouldn't trade it." "Your mother would have been scandalized," Margaret laughed. "But your father—" "I think he would have approved. He always said you had more spirit than sense," meant it as a compliment, mind you. Violet smiled at the memory. "I miss him still." "Of course you do," her aunt said gently. "But you've built something good here, something real." By summer, word of Grayson's horse breeding operation had spread. Buyers came from as far as Missouri and Kansas, impressed by his stock. With the profits, they hired 2 local boys to help with the increasing workload, allowing Grayson to focus on training and breeding while Violet managed the household and accounts. In July, during the worst heat of summer, Violet confirmed what she'd suspected for several weeks: she was expecting their first child. "Are you sure?" Grayson asked, his expression a mixture of joy and concern when she told him. "Quite sure," she smiled. "Around December, I believe." He whooped with delight, lifting her off her feet in a careful embrace. "A Christmas baby!" His enthusiasm was infectious, though Violet couldn't help feeling apprehensive. Childbirth on the frontier was dangerous, and the nearest doctor was in Council Bluffs, a considerable distance in winter. Sensing her worry, Grayson sat her down that evening to make plans. "We'll hire a woman to help when the time comes," he promised. "And I'm going to build a proper room for the baby with a stove to keep it warm." "Our child will need more than a warm room," Violet said, voicing her deeper concern. "Education, opportunities, things that are scarce out here." Grayson took her hands. "Our child will have both of us, which is more than many get. You with your books and learning, me with whatever practical skills I can teach. Between us, I reckon we can raise a child who's ready for whatever life brings." His confidence calmed her fears. "You'll be a wonderful father, Grayson Zimmer, and you'll be an extraordinary mother," he replied. "Poor kid won't stand a chance against your determination." As autumn painted the prairie in golds and reds, Violet's body changed with her advancing pregnancy. Grayson watched in fascination and reverence as her belly swelled with their child, finding her more beautiful than ever. They prepared for winter with the knowledge that it would bring not only harsh weather but new life. Grayson smoked meat, stored vegetables from Violet's garden, and stockpiled firewood until it towered beside the cabin. Violet sewed tiny garments and quilted a blanket for the cradle Grayson crafted from oak. In early December, the first snow fell, bringing with it memories of their meeting nearly a year before. Grayson found Violet standing outside, face turned up to the gently falling flakes. "Should you be out in this condition?" he asked, wrapping his coat around her shoulders just as he had when he found her. "I'm pregnant, not made of sugar," she laughed, but accepted the warmth gratefully. "I was just thinking about last winter, how different everything is now." Grayson placed his hand on her rounded belly. "Reckon it is at that." "I was so lost then," Violet mused, "running from one life without any clear idea of what I was running toward. And now," she turned to face him, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes, "now I know exactly where I belong." 2 weeks later, during a clear, cold night lit by a full moon, Violet's labor began. The midwife they'd arranged, Mrs. Peterson from a neighboring homestead, arrived just as her waters broke. Grayson was banished to the main room where he paced like a caged mountain lion, wincing at each cry from the bedroom. After 12 grueling hours, Mrs. Peterson emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "You've got yourself a son, Mr. Zimmer, and your wife's asking for you." Grayson found Violet propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he entered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Come meet your son," she whispered. With trembling hands, Grayson accepted the tiny infant. The boy had a shock of dark hair like his mother, and when he briefly opened his eyes, Grayson glimpsed a blue that promised to match his own. "He's perfect," Grayson breathed, overwhelmed by the surge of love and protectiveness that washed over him. "What should we call him?" "I thought perhaps Thomas, after my father," Violet suggested. "Thomas Gabriel Zimmer." "Gabriel?" Grayson questioned. "For the angel," Violet explained. "Because he's our miracle." Grayson nodded, too choked with emotion to speak. He returned the baby to Violet's arms and sat beside them on the bed, his family complete in a way he'd never dared hope for. "I love you," he said, kissing her forehead. "Both of you. And we love you," Violet replied. "The man who found me in the snow and wrapped me in his coat and his promise." "Best thing I ever did," Grayson said simply. The years that followed brought both joy and hardship, as frontier life always did. Grayson's horse business flourished, eventually allowing them to build a proper house with multiple rooms and glass windows. Violet, drawing on her experience with her father, became known locally for her skill with herbal remedies and basic medical care. When no doctor was available, settlers would bring their sick children to Mrs. Zimmer for treatment. Thomas grew into a strong, curious boy with his father's love of horses and his mother's quick mind. 2 years after his birth, he was joined by a sister, Margaret Rose, named for Violet's aunt who had since passed away. 3 years later came another son, James William. By 1868, Council Bluffs had grown considerably, benefiting from its position as the eastern terminus of the new transcontinental railroad. The Zimmer property, once isolated, now found itself at the expanding edge of civilization. Land values soared, bringing offers from developers that Grayson consistently refused. "This land is our children's birthright," he told Violet when particularly tempting sums were mentioned. "Worth more than money." As their children grew, Violet ensured they received education beyond what the local school could provide. She taught them literature, history, and science from her expanding library, while Grayson instructed them in riding, tracking, and the practical aspects of running their horse ranch. On winter evenings, Grayson would tell the children the story of how he found their mother nearly frozen in the snow. The tale grew more dramatic with each telling, much to Violet's amusement. And there she was, the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, about to be swallowed up by that blizzard, he would say, eyes twinkling at Violet across the room. So I wrapped her in my coat and promised myself right then that I wouldn't let her go. Did you really, Papa? Little Margaret would ask, wide-eyed. Every word true, Grayson would insist, winking at his wife. Ask your mama if you don't believe me. Your father does tend to embellish, Violet would reply with a smile, but the important parts are true. He saved my life that day. And I've been saving his ever since. In the winter of 1873, 15 years after their fateful meeting, Grayson and Violet stood together on the porch of their home, watching a new snowfall blanket their property. Their 3 children were inside, Thomas reading to his younger siblings before bed. "Still glad I found you that day?" Grayson asked, his arm around her waist. Violet leaned into him, as comfortable in his embrace now as she had been from the first. "Every single day. Even when I track mud into your clean kitchen, or spend too much on a new stallion," he teased. "Even then," she assured him, "though I reserve the right to be momentarily furious about the mud." Grayson laughed, the sound of it as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. At 47, his dark hair was now streaked with silver, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but he was still the same man who had carried her through a blizzard all those years ago. "You know," Violet said thoughtfully, "when I left St. Louis I was so afraid. Of being alone, of failing, of what the future might hold. And now," she turned to face him, taking in the face she had loved for so long, "now I know that some kinds of fear lead you exactly where you need to go, to the person you're meant to find." Grayson cupped her face in his calloused hands. 15 years ago I made you a promise without saying the words, to protect you, care for you, love you for all my days. And you've kept that promise," Violet said softly, "every moment since." As snow continued to fall around them, turning the world white once more, Grayson Zimmer kissed his wife beneath the winter sky, grateful beyond words for the storm that had brought her to him, and the love that had kept her by his side.